Welcome to the A.L.L podcast.
We're the Academy of Logic and Light. I'm Megan.
I'm Kat.
I'm Julie. We are an ethical community education platform that provides a safe space for people to practice their spirituality without indoctrination.
Hey, everybody. I was going to say welcome to Astrology After Dark, but this is the A.L.L podcast.
Astrology is being really weird. I'm just going to have to say it again. Like, it feels aggressively, attacky today. Well, water was spilled on my keyboard.
Yeah.
No, thank you.
But that's what was, glitching me from starting everything else. And then I got a massage from Danny. She tripped over the pedal, which, she works there all the time. Tripping over the pedal is, not something you do. And then the massage gun literally flew back, hit me part in the head, and almost hit her. I was like, okay, I need to go home.
Whatever's going on is not for me.
Yeah.
Anyway, welcome to the A.L.L podcast. This is it, guys. Welcome.
We made it. So, topic today, boundaries.
Boundaries. I love boundaries. When you kind of had your description and I was like, what's kind of like a term that's a little woo-woo that would cover that? And I was like, boundaries. I love boundaries.
Yeah, and you can do that on the 3D world and the 5D world, and you should. Boundaries are sexy.
How do you guys make your boundaries, for yourself? Is there a specific one that, you feel like was easy to make, or something that you struggled with that you feel like is important to kind of share your relationship with that?
Kat, you want to start?
No. Just kidding. Boundaries are such an interesting thing because I think for myself, which may not be uncommon for a lot of people, it took me a long time to understand what boundaries are in general, because I had this misconception that a boundary is me telling someone you can't do that. The burden of responsibility is on the outside thing. When in reality, a boundary is yourself. You can't control anything else that's going on but yourself. In past relationships or even with parents or friends, it was I don't want you to do that. Instead of a real boundary is if you continue to do that, I will remove myself.
Mm-hmm.
So it took me a long time to really understand that. And I think that's the tricky thing about boundaries, because you have to be so brave and so strong when you set a clear boundary, because oftentimes when you set the boundary, you're setting yourself up in a way to break your own heart. Mm-hmm. Because if somebody crosses that boundary, you have to be brave and strong enough to do what you said you were going to do. If you said, I'm not going to be around it, you have to not be around it. Mm-hmm. And that's really hard in general, especially with people that we love or things that we love, because we always want to give people the benefit of the doubt or a second chance or a third chance. And then that's what becomes a toxic cycle or a toxic relationship, is when you set a boundary and then you don't uphold it and you kind of betray yourself in that way, which I really, really learned the hard way, was setting boundaries for myself, that when you set a boundary and you don't uphold it, kind of in a way, your brain doesn't really understand the difference between a betrayal that someone else has done versus yourself. And I found myself for a long time not being able to trust myself, because I had betrayed myself so many times by saying, oh, this is a boundary. Well, I'm going to just let it slide this time. I'm going to forgive them. I'm going to look past it. I'm going to whatever it is, which can be really hard. And then to come back from that, not only learning how to trust other people, but learning how to trust yourself is so difficult. Having clear, strong boundaries can be a really, really difficult thing. And I think we touched on this a little bit in the last episode, but I think that's kind of especially true for empathic people, because we can see on the other side of why they're behaving that way, and we have sympathy for that. We're oh, I feel bad for this person. I feel what they're feeling. I understand what they're going through. I want to be there for them. I want to help them, even though they've crossed a boundary that we made very clear. For me, especially in the beginning, setting boundaries was baby steps, because I had to learn how to trust myself and regain my own trust by
Mm-hmm.
making boundaries and then proving to myself that I could uphold them. So it wasn't like a clear, hard boundary of like, if you continue to do this, I'm going to cut you out of my life. They were little boundaries like, I'm not going to go out on weekdays, or I'm not going to continue to do small things for people that they can do for themselves. Like, I'm not going to clear the dishes for the kids. They are old enough, they can do it for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
That's a boundary that I have. Like, if you're capable of taking care of yourself, you are going to take care of yourself. And then just building on that. I think similarly, when we're talking about like energetics or spirit, I think that it's generally easier to start small and then make bigger and bigger boundaries around that in your space. And I think it's a little bit hard because when you're saying like, I won't allow this thing to happen, or I'm going to remove myself, or I'm not going to be a part of it, or whatever it is that you define, it can get a little bit sticky, I guess, because you can't always control the energy that's like coming at you or influencing you. But, you know, there's definitely been times where I think kind of can discern maybe where that energy or that like psychic attack or whatever you want to call it is coming from.
Mm-hmm.
And then setting really strong boundaries around whatever that is. I forgot the original question.
These are all great answers. I was just asking kind of like what your relationship with boundaries is overall.
Okay,
yeah. And
So that was it.
I love it. Well, and I like that you brought up kind of the way that it can be wishy-washy with like spiritual stuff. And one of my favorite things I've heard was I took a mediumship class, and they said to create your ethics and then use that to create the boundaries that you have with yourself, as well as like the energy that decides to like join you or participate. I really loved that. I loved the thought of like, what would I hold myself accountable for? And what do I like align with my own moral code? And then using that as a way to set my boundaries, I thought was such a good way to look at it, because from that direction, like my morality, I feel like I have a pretty clear set moral code for myself, or like a set of boundaries or ethics that I feel like how I want to interact with the world. For me, hearing it that way was such a cool way to think about the way I want to create my spiritual boundaries, is like, oh, you know, do I want to have spirit messages coming in 24/7? No. Like, do I want to be picking up on energies of people who are completely like disinterested in whatever I'm talking about? No. Like, I'm going to set those ethics and those boundaries up for myself from the beginning. It is pretty easy. I just think that boundaries are an ever evolving thing, because we change and we grow, and we have to be constantly reassessing where our boundaries are. So a little bit of like my relationship with boundaries is I feel like I have big boundaries, especially in like when I think of my spiritual gifts. So when I was younger, I had like terrifying experiences that for me now, I'm like, oh, I never wanted that to happen again. And so I put up these boundaries that were like, if something comes up, I'm just going to ignore it. Like it doesn't exist, because my boundaries are so firm. And so as I've started to like get into the spiritual community, I've really been learning that I can let those boundaries down. I also think that a big thing with boundaries is I think of limiting beliefs. There's so many boundaries that I had up because of limiting beliefs that I had from my upbringing and from my relationship, like growing up in a church that was pretty like, you fit in our puzzle piece and you can't be anything else. And so I had created these boundaries off of these beliefs and my old moral code, or what other people were telling me should be my moral code. And because of that, I've really had to relearn, not just to keep a strong boundary. Like, I feel like I've kind of had that for a long time, but I'm learning that that boundary can move, that I can open myself up and I can create like a boundary that allows space for these things that I didn't believe in or I didn't want to think about for so long. And so I'm kind of getting to the point where I'm like, oh, like, where is my safe space to explore that? And so that's been a really interesting thing that I feel like my word of the year was boundaries. And I was like, how weird. I feel like I'm very clear with my boundaries. And then I was like, oh, it's because I need to expand my boundaries and start, you know, learning and opening myself up to new things. But I need to find the way that I feel safe and the way that feels good to me to do it. And so that's what I've kind of spent like this whole year doing. But I mean, it's definitely been happening well before now. It's just kind of this year I realized that that was, you know, what I needed to focus on.
I like that. Yeah.
The boundaries has like been such a like big thing that's been coming up a lot. But one of my friends was like, if he doesn't know what his own boundaries are, then how can I be breaking them? And I was like, I mean, you got a point though. Like, you know, how can you say like you're not practicing like safe boundaries and stuff? But if you don't know what your own boundaries are, how can other people feel safe communing with you, you know?
Mhm.
And I don't know, that just made me think, but it's also like that it's a moving and breathing contract that you can change at any point. As long as you're in there with your highest self, you're not feeling guilted or manipulated for changing something. You're only changing
Mhm.
it because you're like, okay, I feel strong as shit today. I could do this, you know? And you
Yeah.
move that boundary just a little bit further, but you can always move it back, you know, it's moving and breathing.
Yeah.
And that's okay. It's fun to play with too. My hard boundary in the psychic world is I do not consent to touch. I do not want any demons or any weird shit. Like, don't touch me. Like, you can bring your message across any other way, but not while I'm sleeping. Do not touch. That'll always be a hard boundary. Unless someone's like, hey, your grandma wants to give you a hug, I'll be like, I'm good. I'm fine. But I have the same boundary with bugs, which people always laugh at me because if you'll see me out in nature, something lands on me, I was like, I do not consent to touch. And I swear to you, 15 minutes later, I'll be seeing all these people saying, I do not consent to touch. But it works for the most part. There's definitely some bugs that don't have good hearing.
Yeah, I love how you started that because it's like, yes, it's a moving, breathing thing, but it is boundaries are for you. They're for your highest like interest. And if it's not something that you feel comfortable doing, don't let peer pressure make you move that boundary. And that's why I think I like setting boundaries that like allow space for the thing that I'm nervous about. So like if a spirit wants to communicate to me, okay, but as long as I'm not sleeping and I'll light the specific candle and those are the times you can communicate with me because I'm not going to be mentally prepared for it if I'm like washing the dishes and I see a reflection. Like, no, thank you. I'm not interested.
Yeah, no. Be less creepy.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's very much so it's a moving, breathing thing. But like I find the room that's like, okay, you know, maybe I need boundaries with my parents. And it's like, okay, I cannot deal with you on a bad day. But maybe my boundary is on good days, I call my mom, you know, because it's like, okay, I'm mentally prepared. I can have this conversation. And that's my boundary is just, you know, on a good day, I call my mom. If she calls me on a bad day, like I'm just going to send her to voicemail and I'll send her a message, but I just can't talk to her. Where it's like, okay, you know, I'm having a good day. So I'm going to go out of my way to have this conversation so that I can foster that connection as well as, you know, like I would like to have a relationship with her, but I need it to be a little bit on my terms. And that's my terms, you know, is I'll call her on a good day because I can't control what she's going to say to me. But if I'm in a good mood, like maybe not a good mood, but if I'm like in a good headspace and I'm not upset, then it's easier to have that conversation and be like, all right, well, I don't want to talk about that right now, mom, thanks, you know, versus a day when I'm maybe having anxiety and that kind of stuff. I don't want to talk to her because then she's going to bring these things up and I know I won't be able to handle them well.
I have kind of a similar, I was thinking of like boundaries that are hard, firm, that protect ourselves. And mine is like, my phone goes into do not disturb from this time to this time. And I will only check it if I feel my vibrations high enough to handle anything. Cause I swear only bad news comes in after 10 o'clock. I just cannot. I'm done. It'll still be there tomorrow when I'm fresh. But those are, at first I was getting mad because Kat, you were saying something like how you think about boundaries are for other people. But I was getting so mad when I was like, okay, I don't take calls after 10 o'clock. And people were still texting me. And then I was like, why am I getting mad at the people when I have all of this in my control? Like we can control who even gets through on this. And so it was just like weird to even catch myself in those brain patterns of like getting mad at other people. And I'm like, it's literally me. I'm the one that sets the boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, totally. I totally hear you. I set a boundary about like, don't call me about work stuff after 5 and on weekends. Like I'm not,
Yeah.
there's nothing I can do about any of it anyway until the next working day. And then I would still get like calls or texts. And I was like the same thing. I would get so mad at those people. And I'm like, I don't have to answer. I can send it straight to voicemail.
Yeah.
Like, and they'll get the point.
That
Like, I'm not.
tendency that we have.
Yeah.
It's hard, and it's like deeply ingrained. And I don't know if it's for men as well as women, but I for sure don't know a single woman that hasn't had to deal with the people pleasing.
How do you guys feel like boundaries have helped you like grow spiritually or emotionally? Is there a specific event that you can think of or way that having a boundary has helped you maybe find the right path?
I do think kind of like what you were saying, like having the boundary of who's like trying to contact you. And that just clears out so much chaos. You know, everyone's like, oh, I hear all these different people talking to me. I was like, yeah, but you can't control that. That is you practicing like spiritual boundaries and you can say not tonight. Like, I need rest. I do it for astral projection as well before I go to sleep. And I'm like, hard boundary. I do not want to remember anything in the morning. My physical brain cannot handle it. And then I'll usually give them I have like a run through of what my boundaries are before I go to sleep, like protection wise and all of that. It's helped immensely because it's way less chatter, way less like fight or flight mode. I didn't feel like I was like in constant state of like channeling, which is nice.
Yeah.
Less exhausting. All right, you answer your question.
So for me, I feel like spiritually, I totally agree. Like setting the boundaries clears out the chatter to the point where it's like, okay, when am I ready for this? I feel like there's less persistent messages that will come through. Like it kind of changes and, you know, ebbs and flows that like, if there's something persistent coming through, it'll wait until I'm ready to get it. It'll still be there where it's like, if there's not something that's like meant for me or persistent and it's just like a fleeting little like irritant that wants to come in, those kinds of things, if I keep the boundary up, they're not going to come through until it's time. They don't get the chance and they usually don't end up sticking around. And so it helps me kind of clear out, you know, the chaff of like, what's a message that's going to really help me get further and what's a message that's not going to serve me. And so it kind of helps me create that space of here's what I need. Boundaries also, as an empath, like Kat said, we talked so much about essentially, we're just going to rehash so many of the same things, but protection and like keeping my energy safe has been so important to me. And it's something that I had to learn that was really hard. And it comes down to like a lot of self willpower. How much willpower do I have to keep myself from doing the thing that I'm telling myself I'm not going to do during this time? How much willpower do I have to leave that situation? How much willpower do I have to like not be peer pressured into this thing? Sorry, there's a spider on my ceiling. I've seen 3 spiders today and I want to be like, oh yeah, it's because the weather's changing. But I looked up the meaning and it was like, take a leap. And I was like, dang it. Don't tell me that.
Dangerous advice of not knowing a situation.
Yeah, I was like, thanks. I hate it. I'll be fine.
I don't know what happened. You guys both froze and then it kicked me out. So I guess I lost my internet for a second. Were you still asking like boundaries, how they've helped like with spiritual connection? Is that where we're still? Okay.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure. Yeah, I mean, I think just to echo what you said about it can't be always on. Like there has to be some time when I can just be a human and not feel other people's feelings or hear the noise or whatever it is. I think that boundary specifically of setting up open hours, office hours for that connection really, really helped me develop that connection because it made it less watered down. It was very intentional, very purposeful, but also was, to be in that moment, having that communication without also having my attention pulled in so many different ways, that really helped me to develop that connection on a super, super deep level, I think, so that in those moments when I do need to check in really quick for whatever reason, it's like instant. I don't even have to think about it because I have cultivated that relationship with my higher self, my guides, whomever it might be, in such a purposeful way, instead of just also letting it be part of the background noise all of the time. I would say is the main way that creating that boundary has really helped me grow in that specific arena.
I know you said you didn't hear Julie and I, but that's pretty much all of our answers were. But I really love what you said about like when you have to do it purposefully. And I've noticed this as I've like set office hours, me holding myself to it so much better. Something will come up and I'll be like, well, I'll do it when I get home. I'll do it when I get home. And so like having the office hours really makes me reevaluate those things of like, oh yeah, I said I would do this. I need to go home and do it because I know that's how these messages are going to come through, especially if I'm setting the boundary of like, don't bug me while I'm out, you know? And then I get like a little like tap on the shoulder essentially. And I'm like, all right, I'll do it. And then, if I don't, I find myself kind of like really missing out on opportunities that could have happened, or maybe places that I should have been, things that I should have been paying attention to a little bit better, where once I get home or once I get into my like office hours, and I've just started trying to make it part of like my daily routines is like, okay, I'm going to sit down, do meditation, and then just be like, all right, anything coming through, pull a couple tarot cards, and it makes it so much more purposeful. It's like I'm making that connection stronger. Like when I activate it, I'm activating it with intention of like really being in it. Where if it's just constantly going, it's so much harder to feel like one, I have control over it, and two, like I'm an active participant. Like it's so passive when you just like let the chatter be there versus waiting until you're like turning it on. And then it's like really growing, yourself, because you're like, oh, this is what this feels like. This is the mindset I want to be in if I'm trying to tap into this specific thing. And it really has helped me grow. And so that was great, Kat.
And let's not forget that the more you practice boundaries, you learn how to trust yourself, like Kat was saying. And the instant confidence that comes from that alone is honoring yourself and your highest self. It comes with a whole new glow up that I think people really forget. So boundaries are sexy.
Yeah.
Well, and I think so much of how we want to set boundaries for like exterior forces on our lives, like, oh yeah, I don't want to interact with this, so like my boundary is I'm just going to leave when that happens. But it's so few times that we put boundaries on ourselves. At least I don't think that we necessarily look at them that way. At least I haven't. But when you think of like, oh, I want to eat healthy, as someone who already has like a good relationship with holding boundaries, I feel like that mindset shift can really help me, because it's like, oh yeah, I know what a boundary looks like. I know what it's like to hold myself to that boundary. And now I'm just making it my self-control. So
I always say self-control is a muscle that you have to practice. We're going into the holidays, boundaries, family, all words that come together. What are some quick ways in the 3D plane and the psychic plane that you're sitting down at family dinner and y'all would get to switch the subject or move it to something that you are more comfortable with or something like that?
When it comes to communication, like I love the confrontation of a good discussion in a healthy, like moving forward kind of thing. And I'm pretty lucky that like both mine and my husband's family are relatively good at having the uncomfortable discussions while still being respectful. I do have a tendency to get angry. And so I've set kind of a boundary for myself that like when I start to feel anger is when I'll remove myself from a conversation. I usually, like, again, I don't really set the boundaries for the people around me. If they were getting angry, like that would be a clear, like, you're overreacting. Obviously you don't say that to somebody, but it's like when I start feeling like myself getting heated in an argument, not even like angry, just like maybe I'm being a little too passionate right now. I try to like cool it down, start removing myself a little bit, looking at it from the 10,000 foot view instead of within myself. And that helps me with my personal like where I'm at. And that's how I check what space I need to be in and keep myself in the space that I need. But also, like, I'll get up and I'll just be like, all right, bathroom break. Usually, at least at my house, like, there's several different parties. Like, there's people who are on the back patio, there's people who are in the front room, there's people who are at the table, like in the kitchen. And so usually if I get to a point that it's just like uncomfortable, I am like, all right, I'm gonna go see what literally anyone else is up to. Bye. But we're pretty lucky. I'm just pretty lucky that there's enough groups that generally I can leave a situation without it being too upsetting to anybody.
That's good.
That's nice.
Yeah.
I generally, because I have a super small family, so when it's holidays, typically it's just me, my two kids, my dad, and my two brothers. So I can't just peep to the next room. There's no one in the other room.
Oh.
But typically I go into those circumstances, and I'm not sure why I do this with family more so than I do in any other environment. But when I wall up, like put that defense around myself, I do it as a reflection so that like whatever they're sending at me, like immediately bounces back. Usually when I go into like a public space or I'm hanging out with friends, I do it in more of like a transmutation way where I'm not immediately sending it back. But for some reason with my family, I'm just like, it's just like the shiniest mirror you've ever seen. So bring it. Bing, 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 bing. I guess because I think a part of that is because I'm the only adult female. And so sometimes there is both my dad and my brother are Sagittariuses, so they really like to get into conversations, and they both love to argue just for the sake of arguing, which I don't mind, because I do think that having those healthy arguments does cultivate a greater understanding, or helps you understand yourself and why you're passionate about a specific position that you might take in whatever the conversation is about. But I do feel like over the course of my life, there have been times where they know it gets under my skin, and so they like to dig on purpose. And so I think that's why I do a little bit more reflective when I'm in that specific arena. My dad is less so like that, especially the older that he gets, where my older brother is way more so like that now. So now if things start to get too tense or too heated, or we're on a topic that really you don't want to discuss on a Thanksgiving dinner or Christmas Day or whatever, I try to make light of it. I try to say things like, well, clearly we're going to solve the world's problems today. Or, like just kind of make jokes to, point out that getting this deep into an argument really has no purpose. Like nothing's going to come of this except for maybe some hurt feelings, but nobody's going to accomplish anything per se from the argument. Every once in a while, if it does get too much, I just make the comment. I'll just start agreeing. Like, yeah, I know. You're totally right. You're totally right. Absolutely. Totally. Yep. Because people hate that. Because they know it's so sarcastic. Which it is. But
there's that shiny reflection mirror.
Yeah, exactly. And, I see my family often enough. I generally see my dad and my older brother almost every week. So unless something poignant is going on in the world or in politics or something, we've probably already discussed it on some level before we've reached that place. So it's not so much like that anymore with holidays. For me, the strong boundary that I have to hold around holidays, because we work together, is they don't have a lot, it seems like, going on in their lives outside of work. So all they want to talk about is work. And I'm like, I'm not doing that today. I'm not talking about any of these things. You can talk to me literally about anything else you want. The last TV show that you watched, the last book you read, the last leaf you saw fall from a tree. But I am not fucking talking about work at a holiday gathering. So that's the only, and I will actually say, like, no, we're not talking about that today. We're not, just flat out. And if they bring it up again, I'll just shut it down because I think it's stupid and I don't want to engage. But I do think often, I mean, I do think that it can be very overwhelming for some people. And I do know people that use the bathroom, like what you were saying, Megan, like I'm gonna
my attendants do that all the time.
Yeah, and just go recenter,
It's our only place.
Yeah, which is kind of a bummer that
Smells like shit.
Family can get so intense and crazy, especially around, it's so funny because it's always around times of the year that are supposed to be about family and gathering and appreciating and being grateful, and we're like, you stupid son of a beep.
I've only witnessed these holidays through like people I was dating. Like I didn't know people were like crazy until I started dating and going home with these guys, and I was like, oh lordy, well, this is a good glimmer that I am not marrying into this family. It's gonna be a no for me.
Yeah, I guess part of the lucky part for me is I'm just in part of a family that's like, let's just not talk about it. We'd rather just pretend like you're not gay. It's fine. This is normal. This is just your friend, your roommate that you brought to dinner. It's fine.
The last 42 years.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, that's what my family is also doing with me being a witch. So we just don't talk about it.
Perfect.
It's weird that I have all the crystals.
Yeah.
But now the kids are into rocks, and I'm like, oh, this one's a citrine and this one's amethyst. And the kids are like, how do you know so much about rocks? I'm like, I wanted to be a geologist when I was a kid. I mean, I did.
I love it.
It just translates well now, too.
That's funny. I wanted to be an astronomer when I was a kid, and now I'm like super astrology heavy. Yeah.
Basically, same.
Yeah.
It's funny.
It's like the feminine side of the STEM.
It really is. It's just so funny. Because even I remember taking astronomy in college a couple of semesters ago, and he was like, and this is astronomy, and I don't want to hear anything about astrology. And I was like, I'm going to slip astrology in here. But in a scientific way.
Which is masculine.
It was so aggressive. Like he was like, I don't want to see any astrology. I'm like, well, sorry. The properties of Jupiter.
I'm going to talk about Jupiter today because it's Thursday.
It felt like a soft boundary I could push to bring it back to boundaries and all.
Yeah. What were you going to ask, Kat?
Oh, I was just gonna ask Julie if she had, because of her parents being so religious, if there was like holiday boundary pushing, like when you go home.
Yeah, I set up a little altar in a corner, hide dirty clothes on top of it because just in case, don't want to ruffle any feathers. And then we all blindly pretend that I don't drink or do drugs and have sex, and that I basically would be a virgin had I not been divorced for 18 years. Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and I do that for about 3 days, and then I try to come home as quickly as possible. Those are my boundaries. one day it's going to change. I am a little feisty sometimes, especially like if I'm like sneaking a little mug of alcohol during the holidays and hot topic comes up, like you said, that are unavoidable, like world things. And it's just like, sometimes I get so aggressive with the like Republican Pentecostals in the South that I just sometimes like to sneak in like, well, that's not very like God loving of you. And like really bring it back home. And yeah, sometimes it puts it in perspective. And I'm like, I think Jesus made those people, so we should probably be loving them, right? Like super basic, but I'm just the neighborhood witch. I do like to stir up a little trouble every now and then, but for the most part, my family is just like really, really nice people. They sweep everything under the rug. We just don't talk about it, and it'll be like that until the day we die, I think, and that's it. It's
That's
quiet
it.
at least,
Right.
unless you're at the parrots. Parent, and it's not. Who can
parrots
hear
do
other
that.
people's chaos over the parrots?
It's a lot easier to ignore whatever Julie's doing if the parents just scream all day.
My emotional inner duress can't hear it over the pack of parrots.
It's fine.
That might be the point. I get it now.
That's what I think of like my mom. And so I feel like I've kind of had a boundary of just like, I'm just not going to talk about this stuff because I don't want her to feel uncomfortable. I don't want to hear it. Like, and then I'd be like, hey mom, can you watch my kids? And she's like, why? And I'm like, well, I'm doing this thing. And she's like, tell me more about the thing. And I'm like, okay, I will. Like, but it's like, I went from having like I have a like witchy study group, and I've always called them just my book club. And I'm like, yep, I'm just going to book club, or like, I'm just going to my study group. And my mom will be like, what are you studying? And then I slowly was like, all right, we're studying
Demonology.
astrology. And she's like, oh, fun. Like, whatever, you know? And then I told her I started a business, and she's like, oh, what's your business for? And I was like, reading cards. And she's like, okay. And like, she doesn't really ask me any questions, but I'm like, if you ask me the questions to get to that point, I'm going to tell you. And then she's usually
don't
like,
ask
oh,
questions that you don't want the answers to.
yeah. And then she's like, all right, well, I guess I'm going to go a different direction. But like,
Well,
I had tarot cards.
trying.
Yeah. And I had like tarot cards on my birthday, and like, I had everyone kind of sign on one. And I like handed the deck to my mom, and I was like, hey mom, here's what we're doing. And she's like, all right. And she like picked one. Of course, it was the Empress, but that's just her.
Oh yeah. That's amazing.
Yeah.
I love a first card to draw.
I know.
Yeah, that's so funny. I never thought about this before. This is kind of off on a tangent, but my dad's like totally the opposite. I don't really talk to him about any of the stuff that I do, like in the spiritual world or anything like that, because he's like super atheist and he just thinks it's nonsense. So it's like the total opposite of like parents that don't like it because they think you're going to go to hell. My dad's just like, it's such a waste of brain power and time. Like, it's just, you're not a child, grow up kind of thing, you know?
Yeah.
And it's still like in that space of how much information do you disclose about what you're up to and what you're doing? Because I just don't want to keep having that conversation, you know, or like whatever it is that I'm like, it's an interesting thing, especially when you put it in the context of boundaries, like what the boundary of disclosure is when you're talking to somebody that you know doesn't agree with your life. Because I want to be honest with people, especially family. I don't want to be like lying for sure. And I don't necessarily want to hide things from people that I care about. But at the same time, it's like, I know they don't get it. So kind of like, what's the point?
And if you don't feel emotionally safe, then that's your boundary.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's like, the more you try to explain it, the more they're just like, I'm like, okay, well, because yeah, I think that's a really good point, Julie, that it is about emotional safety. That
I started doing the same with even friendships. If I know someone's going to be emotionally volatile when I tell them the truth, then I'm just not going to be as honest and brutal. I just take it down to whatever I feel is safe, but still communicating what I can.
Well, and that's how I feel like, again, how the boundaries are constantly moving, because I've always had such a firm boundary with my mom of like, we just don't talk about it. Like, I told her that I left the church and that was enough. Like, she knows that I'm on a different path now and we're just going to leave it. But yeah, it was like a slow moving of like, oh, you know what? I feel comfortable enough, like, having this discussion with you. I at the very least feel emotionally safe enough in my decision to do this, that when I share it with you, no matter how you receive it, I feel confident in myself that I'm not going to be hurt by how you receive it.
Mm.
And it's like, once I realized that I got to that point and that was my boundary of like, oh, I am comfortable with this choice now. I am like, feel like I'm on the right path. And I do like have a strong conviction for what I'm doing. And then it made it easier for me to open my boundary, because and maybe that's part of it, is like, I think of a boundary as like a fence around a space, right? And it's only since I like started earlier today in this exact conversation. I started thinking, I was like, I kept saying space, and I was like, you know what? To me, like, a boundary is a little fence around a thing. And it's like, once I can fill up or create the space that I can open that boundary or reinforce that boundary with, like, I create a space that's like safe for where I can have that conversation. I create a space that, is safe for me to go to. And that's where I draw my boundary, is like, okay, where am I safe? I think of like a pen that your livestock is in, like horses are in a pen. And I'm like, okay, now my pin can go here. I can have that conversation only in this event, but when I'm ready, I'll trot on over and go into that. And so it's like, my boundaries are just like this space that is like where I'm happy and where I feel comfortable. And then, going outside of that is just going to be reevaluating where I'm at to find the next step outside of it. Anyway.
Like graduation.
Yeah.
I like it.
Yeah, I like
But
that.
it's true though. Like your response to things when you're in a higher frequency might be like safer for everyone, but you have to be in that good space.
Yeah.
Like I've noticed if I'm in a lower frequency, like I've had a lot of bad things, I'm a lot more short-tempered and a lot less patient. So it's going to be a hard boundary that we don't have a difficult conversation at this time, but not in an avoidant way or anything. Just be like, hey, can we put a pin in this? I just really have to like recharge my battery. I'm not okay.
Yeah.
That's a hard boundary, but it's honestly been one of my favorite ones lately.
Well, and it's so hard because we've talked so much about how other people don't necessarily respect our boundaries. It's us who uphold it. But because we're upholding those boundaries, it can also hurt other people. And I think that is probably the hardest part, because I know Julie kind of mentioned, like, we're people pleasers. Like, I know that I am. It's something I've always struggled with, is like, how do I prioritize myself over everything else? And as I've like found, again, my conviction in who I am, it's easier for me to hold that boundary. And so I feel like that's a good way to, if you feel like holding a boundary is hurting other people, I almost feel like reevaluating why you yourself are creating that boundary is going to help you not feel bad about the other person's reaction to your boundary. Because you're like, no, like, if I let my mom say that to me, or if I let my dad, do this thing, it's not going to make me comfortable. And so I have to leave. Like, the second that things get elevated at the house, I have to go, because that's just, I'm not going to handle it well. They're obviously not handling it well. I'm out. And having those boundaries, like, other people are going to be offended by that, but that's not why I have a boundary. I have a boundary for me. And as I became more convicted to myself and more honest with myself about why I was feeling ways, and it's probably a little bit, I think, of like shadow work, right? Of evaluating why a situation makes you feel a certain way, and then finding where that boundary is, and then reassuring yourself that like this boundary is healthy. This boundary is so that I don't have to go to this dark place, no matter how anyone else is taking it. Like the boundary is for me, and that's okay.
You're the only one living in this existence for yourself. Like
Yeah.
everyone else has to deal with their own shit.
Yeah,
Sorry.
absolutely.
That's how I feel about it.
Yeah. And so enforcing your boundaries doesn't hurt anybody. But I also think that's another important thing is enforcing your boundaries shouldn't be forcing someone else to conform to your boundary. It should be you enforcing it for yourself, and that other person either stays or they don't, but you're not trying to press somebody into the cookie cutter of your boundary.
Yeah, and I think this is a good example of like where oftentimes communication can be super helpful of when you're communicating that boundary to someone. I feel a lot less bad if they have a negative reaction to a boundary once I've communicated the boundary to them. And oftentimes I try to word it in a way like, I'm not doing this to be hurtful to you, but if I don't take this time out now, it's going to be so much worse later. So you can have your feelings mildly hurt now or big hurt later. Because if you push and push and push, I'm going to get to the point where I'm going to be super mad. And then I'm going to just go, I'm not talking to you for a solid week or whatever it is. When I've asked you to stop talking about this thing, or I've asked for a change in the dialogue, or I've said, I'm not going to participate in this behavior, and you push and push and push, it's going to go one way and it's not going to be a good way. So, you know, making sure that that boundary is clear and that it's not about them. It's about yourself. Like, I need this for myself. And if you respect me as a person, it shouldn't hurt your feelings that I need to take a step back or out or whatever it is. And I think sometimes, I mean, I definitely forget this, especially in a weird way, because I am kind of such a hyper emotional person. So, like, for example, I try not to talk about what's bothering me while it's bothering me, because then I get way more reactive than if I have like a minute, like, let me just center, calm down, and then we can have a conversation about it. But my emotions show very easily on my face, so people know when I'm upset, and so they'll be like, oh, what's wrong, what's going on? And then I'll say, I don't want to talk about it right now. And then the natural reaction from another person is like, it's okay, you're safe here, we can talk about it, we can have this conversation. And so then I will become super emotional about whatever it is, which oftentimes makes it worse than if I would have just held my boundary and been like, I don't want to talk about it right now. But I know that they're coming from a good place, and they do mean that it's a safe space to talk about it. But I let that boundary slide of, I don't want to talk about it right now. And then I generally explode in some sort of emotional way on people. I think a lot of people in my life have kind of learned that about me. So now when I say I don't want to talk about it right now, they're like, please God, don't talk about it.
I'm like, we know.
But it is interesting. And I think especially, I mean, I think this is really common, especially because of the empath narcissistic relationship that we talked about in the last episode, that people that have narcissistic tendencies, everything's about them. So when you make a boundary, they're automatically going to be offended and make the assumption that it's about them, when really boundaries are only about the person that set up the boundary. It doesn't have anything to do with anybody else, but protecting themselves in some way.
And the best way to deal with a narcissist is to ignore them. Just saying, they hate that shit. Time out.
Just sarcastically agree with them. It's great.
Yeah.
It takes like an hour for them to be like, wait a minute, this is the best we've ever gotten along.
Yeah. They're like, oh, finally you've seen the light. Specifically when I know you talk about, like, you even mentioned it here, like the astral projecting. Do you feel like when you're going to the astral plane, Is there any specific boundaries that you feel like you need to set when you're doing that, or that you've set for yourself? Do you like have any advice on how, like, kind of what that looks like as a boundary in your practice and when you're doing that?
I mean, for me, really, like I mentioned, I try not to have like this brain remember everything that I do at night, because it's just like a little jarring. And I know like I'm out there doing all kinds of things, and people are literally messaging me weekly, like, "Oh my God, you were in my dream, and we were doing this and this," and it's too much. Like I just can't. I can't comprehend. I can't process that and this world right now. And that's a hard boundary I have. But I definitely take times, like you were kind of saying, like where you set intentions aside to like, okay, these are the days I'm open to remembering what it was that I did. As far as a hard boundary goes, like I've created my specific portals for protection, and I feel like I'm pretty well versed and trained to hop in there whenever I feel safe. And I have different protections that I use to like be safe in that world. Yeah, I think my biggest boundary is that my body doesn't feel drained when I wake up. Like that the spirit world should be completely spirit and my body should be completely this world, because it's just too much. So brain and body, hard differentiations.
Kat, do you have any experiences of like how boundaries specifically have like helped you at some point in your practice, aside from just the overall that we've kind of talked about of office hours?
Yeah, I mean, kind of to lean back into what you said about putting boundaries in line with your ethics, especially in my practice. That's a big part of it. I mean, obviously, I have the boundaries around the space, protecting and not allowing certain levels of energy or whatever to enter the space, all that type of stuff set up. I won't ever read for people without permission. Before every session, I always ask the client, sometimes things pop up. Do you want me to talk to you about them? Do you want me to not say anything? Do you want to wait until the end of the session and then you can decide? Because sometimes things will come up as I'm working on someone. And if they have said like, no, I just finished skiing, I just want a good massage, great. I will set that boundary to like my guides, to their guides. He's made it clear there's no messages coming through. I don't want to hear anything. I don't even want the option to hear it. If they say no, for whatever reason, that is their choice. And that's a boundary that I won't cross. And I think that's the same thing kind of just in general with stuff in the kind of esoteric space. I don't like when people say, I got this message about you. Bitch, no, you didn't. And I know we've talked about this before.
Yeah.
But I just think it's such bad spiritual hygiene to just walk around trying to peek into everybody's field, into everybody's life.
Just because you have the access and the power doesn't mean you need spiritual hygiene. Is just such a good word for it, because
Yeah. Don't go putting your stuff in everybody's business. It's just like the same thing with I don't walk around sticking my fingers in everybody's mouths. Don't go sticking your sight inside everybody's fields. Like it's just not. So I think that's a pretty good one that I am pretty strong with in my practice for sure.
I love that. I feel like for me, boundaries with my practice, like also it's very along the lines of kind of what you were just saying, Kat, of like, I don't go and poke everybody in the mouth, but also like, I don't want everybody's mouth on my finger, like gross. So, who knows, especially people who are just like, living in the 3D world. And as an empath, like I can walk into a room and I can just like feel someone's emotions. And I'm like, oh, you're upset. Like, I don't want to feel upset. Like I came here for a good time. Like, and I feel like boundaries are good for me in a way that like, I'm not picking up everybody else's energy. I'm defining myself by those boundaries, and I get to be myself within those boundaries. It's like when I push myself outside of them, I have to appease somebody else, or I have to be, sad because this person's sad. And now I feel sad because I let that person into my space and I wasn't ready for it, And so I think that having a clear boundary for me has really helped me like find my authenticity in a spiritual way. This is what my energy feels like, because I feel like I walk around and I just am being hit by waves of energy and I'm just like, okay, I don't want these things. And so it's nice to go out and be like, oh, I'm going to go out dancing. And the only thing that I need to be worried about right now is myself. Like, oh yeah, like I get to go out. I don't need to worry about the bachelorette party. I don't need to worry about, this couple that's breaking up. Like, I'm going to have a good time because that's what my energy level is at, and I'm going to protect it. Do you guys have any thoughts on boundaries and protection in the more physical sense, not just in the 3D emotional mental plane or the 5D emotional spiritual plane, but like in the physical? Do you have any thoughts on that, like protective aspect of a boundary?
Well, I definitely think that's kind of along the same lines as like creating a bubble around your house or runes at your front door, that are a hard line, you shall not pass boundary. Honestly, for me, I kind of outsource a lot of that stuff to like my people that are around me. Mostly because I feel like, and it might be because I'm a single parent, but I feel like the mental, emotional, spiritual task of protecting myself and my two kids gets so draining sometimes that it's hard for me to hold physical boundaries as well, which I have learned the hard way because I have had people come into my house and like steal things that they'll learn the hard way that you don't steal from a witch. Instantly knowing like this person shouldn't be in my house, but not having the physical boundary in place beforehand makes it so much more of a mental load than it needed to be, right? Like having a good physical boundary in place from the beginning takes away so much of the back end work that you have to do when it's not in place, obviously. So now, recently, I've really kind of started cultivating a relationship with my house and the energy of the house specifically to offload some of that task work to the house. Like, I love you, I take care of you, I keep you clean, let's look after each other. You're going to guard the door along with these other things, and people with certain energy levels or intentions just can't come through that door. And it's super fascinating once you learn how to set those boundaries for yourself in a physical sense, how quickly it happens. And also it's so interesting to see how it happens, like so-and-so is going to come over today, and then, oh, they got in trouble that they can't hang out anymore. Oh, isn't that convenient? Like just little things that will come up that will make it so that they can't come into the space. Have you ever watched the movie The Skeleton Key? It's like a 90s, early 2000s kind of horror movie.
Oh, wait, maybe was it Kate Hudson or some one of the blonde ones? Yeah.
I'm like, it was so long, but yeah.
Wait, I watch scary movies, but Kate Hudson wasn't less scary.
Yeah. For some reason, that movie kind of really messed me up for a while. But there's one part in that movie, I don't know if you remember, where she gets the red brick dust and she lays it across the threshold of the door, and the lady can't cross the door. That taught me so much about setting physical boundaries and the intention and the work that help hold those physical boundaries. So anytime the conversation about physical boundaries with homes specifically comes up, I always think about that scene because it's just so emblazoned in my mind. I think that was the first time when I saw that movie, I was like, holy shit, like you can actually do that? Like you can set a boundary that somebody cannot cross? That's amazing.
I did it with my roommate in New York.
Oh.
It worked. It was super trippy.
Yeah.
Really weird. Yeah, my other friend, have believed it. She saw it with her own eyes and she was like, and I was like, yeah, there's soap at that door. She thinks it's kitty litter.
Oh, nice. Yeah. Yeah. Outside of like my home, I don't know that I necessarily have like physical. I mean, obviously, I have boundaries around like my don't touch my body without consent. Oh, I guess my car. There's some. I've done some work on my car. As a physical boundary.
Those are mine as well. It's weird that you mentioned that you were working with your house like as a protection, because I was doing the same work this week. And like I don't know, I heard it like last week or a couple weeks ago, something about like, I mean, I always knew that my house and I, like, we have a vibe. It's clear when you walk in. But this week I'm like scrubbing the floors and doing the baseboards and everything, trying to get it like deep clean before my surgery on Thursday. And I'm like, okay, you like get the house ready. And you could just feel such like this, like, and like the house was like, all right, I'm at your service again. Like we're feeling good. And it was like such a physical reaction. I was like, I am so sorry I've neglected you. I haven't been home all month.
Just like
even
the
cat's still better in it too. Yeah. Like obviously, my cats are huge protections, and the happier the cat, the happier we all are, but specifically because they do so much spiritual work as well. But it also, it goes forward into my car. And other than that, I rely on my psychic gifts and my ancestors when I'm in public and signs and things. I'm pretty open and aware, like going out for any messages of warning specifically. Other than that, I'm not trying to like download some intense ass messages while I'm driving. But like if you guys are trying to tell me to not run that yellow light, I'm listening. Simple.
Yeah. I love that you both brought up like kind of the idea of working with your house spirit, right? I think there's a culture, I'm sure there are several cultures that worship like the house spirit as part of the family almost, not worship, but like treat it like part of the family. It's just as important. It's, like Julie said, it's contributing to the happiness of this whole organism, right? Is where we live and where we stay. And so I love that so much. I also really like, if you've ever heard of servitors, I think that they're great in helping creating and setting like a physical boundary. And it's very similar to like working with a house spirit, right? You decide how you're going to, like, what the relationship is, what you need it to do, what you want it to do, and then how you feed it, right? Like you can't just be like, okay, now go do your thing, and then it just hangs out and does nothing. Like you have to be constantly working on that connection as well. And so I really like the servitors as a way to kind of give myself a home protection. And it has had such a crazy effect. Like my son told me the other day that his heater spoke to him. And I was like, okay, great. And like, I don't know if it was in a dream completely or not, but it was in the middle of the night. And he's like, and it told me to come in here because it wasn't safe in my room tonight. And I was like, sure, great. Like, I'm not going to argue with it. And my husband, because I had to tell him, like, I tell him about all the stuff I'm doing. I'm like, hey, just so you know, like, this is happening, so that I don't expect him necessarily to consent to it, but I'm just like, hey, like, this is what I'm working on, especially if it's going to involve him or the kids in some way. I want him to know that I'm like being respectful of their boundaries while also being like, I'm creating a boundary for all of us because we need it. And so I really love that. So I really try to like keep him involved in all the stuff. And I was like, so Elliot told me this thing and it's super weird. What do you think of this? And he was like, well, that's an interesting coincidence. And I'm like, that's what you call it. I told him, I'm like, I officially have stopped believing in coincidences. Like I'm not reading into everything, but I'm taking note of anything that feels like a coincidence and really like letting it sit, because I'm like, wow, that was such a weird thing. But you know what? I'm not going to question it. And we'll just keep going and we'll see how this evolves and all of the things. So it's been so interesting learning to do that, working and learning what it means for myself and my family. And I feel like even though my husband is not witchy, magical, practicing at all, when I feel like I inform him of these things and they're in line with his values as well, or something he would want, which is a safe house, great, it strengthens my working, even though he isn't like putting anything into it. But if he agrees with my intention, like his energy does come into play. And it's really cool to have that kind of backing up the decisions that I'm making and the things that are going on, because it really feels like it helps shore up, those boundaries that I'm setting, that I'm like, okay, if I were doing this thing, what would you want to include? Those are some of my ways that I really like doing a physical protection. I also feel like I bubble up out anywhere else. Like if I feel like a commotion happening while I'm at the park or something, I like put a hard and fast like bubble over my people, my things, like so quick. I was at a club or something, and there was this girl who just seemed really judgy. And we were all like having a good time. And she was like sitting there with like, she had like a chihuahua with her. And she's like in her like cocktail dress. And I'm, me with green hair and jeans on and ruining a vibe, whatever. And so I'm like, and she was just, the way that she was like kind of interacting with the people around her. And then at one point she like had her phone up and was pointing it at somebody. And I was just like, this is not okay. And I like bubbled that space. And when I watched her walk out the door within like 30 seconds of when I was like, no, this is not happening. Like, we're here for a good time. If you're not, you can get out. And she walked out within like 30 seconds, and I did not see her the rest of the night. And she didn't walk out the front door. She walked out to the smoking like patio. And then I was like, all right, well, that problem's solved. Anyway, it was just one of those things that I was like, you didn't come here to judge us. And it wasn't like, oh, you leave. It was like, if you're not here for a good time, leave. And that's when she walked out. And I was like, well, great. We solved that issue. And she didn't come back from the smoking patio. Like, I don't think the rest of the night. I never saw her. I think her boyfriend came in and got her drinks and stuff. And I was just like, yeah, like this isn't happening. And I bubbled that whole space, that whole dance floor. I was like, this is for good times.
I do bubbles like that for me and my friends. But I like this is a good vibes spot. I like that a lot.
Do you guys have any other questions or thoughts on boundaries that you can think of?
I don't think I do. Of course, at like 4 a.m. is when I'm going to have all the burning questions. But honestly, like I feel like we covered quite a fair amount, like not only the 3D, 5D, family members, protections, ways to prevent it, ideas.
Yeah.
Basically a beauty elixir.
Yes.
Yeah, like what else could you ask for?
Thanks for joining the A.L.L podcast.
To find out more, you can find us online at academyoflogicandlight.org or on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok at Academy of Logic and Light.
If you live in the Salt Lake Valley, we'd love to see you at one of our upcoming events.
And don't forget to support our growth by joining our Patreon.
Until next time, lead with logic and light.